Tonight's topic is a very serious and important one, a continuation of what we spoke about last week. And I want to kick it off with a little bit of a presentation. I don't usually do this, but I thought this was really cool. So I typed over here a very important message. Everyone could see it. I want to read it. See, very important message. I'll put it here for the camera. It's a very, very important message. And for those listening online, I'm going to post it in the show notes. And this is so important, but the problem is that it's written in Morse code. This is such valuable information. In fact, I'm going to read you the information. It's so valuable and so important and so critical, but when you look at it, it's inaccessible. If you wanted to read this and to understand the message, you'd have to get a Morse code book and then go, okay, with dash, dot, space, right? And it'll take you like maybe a few hours. But you need to work really hard to understand it. When we talk about the Oral Torah, Written Torah, think of it as two documents. Imagine it's two documents, right? I have on one hand the Written Torah. You want to read the Written Torah and understand it, you're going to have the Oral Torah. Yeah, it has everything there. If you can understand the Written Torah, you are way ahead of the game. If you actually understand the Written Torah, you get it all. However, the problem is that it's written in Morse code. To understand Morse code, you have to have the decryptor key. You have to decode it. It's encrypted, and you have to try to understand it. When we look at the Written Torah enables us to understand the enigma that is the Written Torah. You read the Written Torah, you have no idea what you're doing. You get the general ideas, you get the meanings behind some mitzvahs, you get the flavor, you get the structure. You know that on Sukkot you have to sit in something for 7 days. What that thing is, what are the rules are, you have no idea. It's all hidden. It's all encoded. When we have the Oral Torah opens it up. It's the decryption code. It makes it understandable and usable and applicable to each and every one of us. Tonight's topic is going to be centered around this relationship, this coexistence, and interdependency of these two bodies of work. We have the Written Torah. It's got 5,845 sentences. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's what it is. 5,845 verses. It's got, I think, 304,805 letters. Depends how you count. It could be even a lot more. It's a very it's confined. It's 54 sections, parshios. It's 5 different books. But it's very defined. It's very limited, so to speak. And then when we talk about Oral Torah, we're talking about an infinite amount of explanation and of understanding and of guidelines and of limitations and of source material and other scenarios. It's an infinitesimally larger amount of information. And the question that I want to try to understand tonight is, why do we have this coexistence, this dual methods of instruction? So on one hand, we have the Written Torah, but we have the Oral Torah companion to that as well. And the critical question I want to ask, which is a question that people ask a lot, especially people that are not so keen on the details of the Oral Torah, is why was the Oral Torah just not written down? Just write it all. Just simplify it for us. Why do you have to have, for 1,500 years since Moses teaches us the Oral Torah, you have it being transmitted orally? Why not just write it all down? You write it down, and that's much easier to convey to the next generation. If I wanted to give you a copy of Moby Dick, right, I could just give you a copy, and you could copy it or to take pictures of it and give it to the next person. It's very simple to transmit. Oral Torah, if it's being transmitted orally, it's a lot of details, a lot of information. It's a tremendous amount of information. Write it down, simplify it for everyone. Why was the Oral Torah not written down? Okay, so that's an important question. Tonight we're going to go through I've collected 9 different answers to that question. 9 different answers as to why the Oral Torah was oral, and then next week we'll talk about, okay, why was it eventually written, what that process was about. So actually, to be clear, just for the sake of clarity, I want to point out that the Oral Torah indeed was written. And in fact, what I started off the talk with, is actually the Morse code that corresponds to the Rambam, Maimonides, when he writes about the Oral Torah being written out incrementally. He says as follows: Rabbi Judah the Prince, famous leader of the Jewish people at the end of the 2nd century, he's known as our holy teacher, he wrote the Mishnah. From the time of Moshe until Rabbi Judah the Prince, no one had written a work from which the Oral Torah was publicly taught. Rather, in each generation, the head of the court or the prophet of the time wrote down for his private use notes on the tradition he had heard from his teachers, but he taught in public from memory. So this is a very important point. To say that the Oral Torah was not written for 1,500 years is a little bit of a mistake. It was not canonized. It was not codified. It wasn't finalized in a final canon that's immutable text that this is the authoritative Mishnah or this is the authoritative Talmud. That only happened 1,500 years after Moses. However, from the time of Moses, all the way the successive 15 centuries until it was finally written, it was being written in each generation, written and refined, and the notes were passed on internally. The only difference is that there was no public work, written work, that was available for everyone, and that was the authoritative work that was not to be amended. Continues the Rambam. So to each individual wrote down, according to his ability, parts of the explanation of the Torah and its laws that he had heard, as well as the new matters that developed in each generation, which had not been received by tradition, but had been deduced by applying the 13 principles for interpreting the Torah, and had been agreed upon by the great rabbinical court. Such has always been done until the times of Rabbi Judah the Prince. So ironically, the claim that the first time the Oral Torah was written was the time of Rabbi Judah the Prince, when the Mishnah was formalized about the year 200 of the Common Era, is doubly wrong. Not only was it not the first time, but indeed there were so many written renditions of the Oral Torah, that what he did was not write a new one, but rather condense, or so to speak, codify the existing body of Oral Torah in a finalized text. So it's almost as if before Rabbi Judah the Prince, we have many, many, many individuals and leaders writing down the Oral Torah. And Rabbi Judah, from the time of Rabbi Judah the Prince, thenceforth, we have a single solitary rendition of the Mishnah. So that's just for clarity's sake. The Oral Torah was written, it just wasn't finalized and canonized in an authoritative version. The real question we have to ask, by the way, what I just read from the Rambam, this is it in Morse code. Lots of dashes, but if you wanted to get the wisdom, this probably wouldn't be the best way to get it. You want to get the wisdom of the Torah, the best way to get it is via the Oral Torah. But the big question is like this. Why did Moshe gave us an authoritative written Torah? Why would he not give us as well an authoritative Oral Torah as well in a written format? Now, not only did we not have it, in fact, there is a prohibition against writing down the Oral Torah. The reason why everyone up to the time of Rabbi Judah the Prince taught publicly from memory is because the Torah mandates that the Oral Torah cannot be written down. There's a prohibition against writing down the Oral Torah. So the question is, perplexing. Why is it so much better to have the Oral Torah in an oral format and not written down that the Torah wanted to enforce it by saying it's prohibited to write down? In fact, you read what the Talmud says, this is from the Talmud, that if someone writes down, Rabbi Yochanan says, if someone writes down the Oral Torah, it's as if he is burning the Torah, which is very harsh words. And it's essentially saying that the only way the Torah can continue and flourish, the only way for us to not have disruption in Torah transmission is if the Oral Torah remains oral. So, just this kind of amplifies our problem. It's not only that it wasn't written down because no one ever had the time to write it down in an authoritative way. Remember, Moshe was the most talented rabbi we've ever had. If Rabbi Judah the Prince could have done it, certainly Moses could have done it, right? But Moses doesn't need to study from anyone. He studied straight from God. So Moses could have written it down. But there was a conscious decision not to write it down and, in fact, to prohibit its final writing down. The question is why? Why is it so much better to have the Oral Torah in oral format and not written down? That's our question of the evening. And behold, let's try to examine some of the ideas here. Okay, so I want to start with the first reason. And this is it's going to illustrate why the Torah is such a dramatically different corpus of knowledge. Remember, we claim that the Torah comes from God. The written Torah is authored by God. The Oral Torah is delivered to us by God via Moshe. This is all from God. But who are the stewards of Torah? Who's in charge of maintaining the Torah? Who's in charge of teaching the Torah to the next generation? Who's in charge of perpetuating Torah? Well, that's not God's responsibility. That's our responsibility. And the Almighty wanted, obviously, to enable us, to give us the tools, to give us the capacity to take the Torah that we got from Him, unadulterated Torah, written Torah, oral Torah, together, and teach it to successive generations until this very day. In 2016, right, we're talking about 327 or 28 years after Mount Sinai, we could still claim that the Torah that we have today is the same Torah that the Almighty gave Moses at Mount Sinai, and it hasn't been corrupted till now. That's an audacious claim, right? 300 some odd years of different societies and civilizations, turmoil, upheaval, dispersal, right? So many things have happened to our nation. Right? And yet, the claim is there, and it's just a bold claim. But that obviously was the intention of the giver of the Torah, i.e. the Almighty. So the Almighty is going to select a method of giving the Torah that is the best method to ensure that it won't be forgotten. Remember, our society, right, we think we're so clever. But I will prove to you that we are so terrible at this, and humans are so terrible at this. We think, I'll just say what I want, I'll even write it down, I'll simplify it, and I'll give that document over to someone else, and they'll never have any misunderstandings. And the reason why it sounds so simple, but we have a great example. It's the best example, the Constitution, right? The United States Constitution. It was written by very intelligent people, clearly with the intention of it being understood by future generations. It's only a couple hundred years ago. It's really not so long ago. Yet there's tremendous debate. This is not written in a foreign language. It's not like we have to translate from Latin. This is English, written by very intelligent people. That's not so much information. Right? Ted Cruz, our senator, he memorized the Constitution when he was like in high school. It's not so much information. It's vastly more simple and less information than the Torah. Yet, our society today grapples with the very basic, fundamental, simple principles of the Constitution. Just the basics. Just what do the words even mean? And it's incredible. It's not like, there's things that were left unsaid. The Constitution wrote everything that the architects of the Constitution wanted to say, because they assumed it would be understood forever. Boy, were they wrong. It's incredible. Like our society, just this debate today. Everywhere you go, there's debate. First Amendment, Second Amendment. Those are unanswered questions. And the question is why. So clearly we see that maybe we're not so good at transmitting information in a method, right, via writing it down to ensure that it will be understood by future generations. Now, the most talented entity in the world at transmitting information is God. Is it so out of the question to assume that God would use a different formula than us silly humans do to try to perpetuate information? That's not such a big leap to climb over. Right? Of course, that makes sense. So we look at the oral Torah and written Torah, that coexistence, that dual instruction format as being God's way of writing and of teaching orally the Torah to ensure it won't be forgotten. So I think that's the initial idea. The initial idea is that the oral Torah, written Torah are each going to work with each other to ensure fidelity to truth. For example, we spoke about this a little bit in previous weeks. You have written Torah. What does it mean? Go to the oral Torah. You have oral Torah. Well, what does that mean? You go to written Torah. It's almost like a checks and balanced system wherein there has to be perfect uniformity between written Torah and oral Torah. Remember, the Almighty gave it to us perfectly. If it's messed up, we made a mistake along the way. You look at the Talmud. The Talmud is constantly working between trying to make sure that there's perfect uniformity and compatibility between both vastly different ways of being given over the same information. If we have this Morse code, and we have the accompanying document, and they're not perfectly aligned, well, we made a mistake in the transmission, so to speak. So if the Almighty is going to employ this just tremendously innovative method, right? I'll give the same information in radically different ways. And both will have to be perpetuated independent of each other. Because you have to have a written document. You write a Torah scroll, you copy from an existing Torah scroll, you copy from another existing Torah scroll. That is the same. We have the same Torah. Like we know, we found Torah scrolls that are 2,400 years old. Same Torah scrolls that we have today. That's perpetuated, how the Torah scroll is perpetuated. You copy it from an existing Torah scroll, you mouth out the words. But oral Torah is not done in solitude in your basement copying from a Torah scroll. It's done in a class setting, in a yeshiva setting, in a masifta setting. Parents to children, teachers to students, leaders of the generation to their constituents, one generation to another generation. And at any point in time, if we find a discrepancy between these vastly different methods of the transmission, we know we have a problem. Thus, each one of them ensures that the other one maintains its accuracy throughout the ages. Every time the Talmud, every single page of the Talmud, and we have Gary here to attest if that's true. Every single page of the Talmud, it quotes a halacha, a law, an oral Torah law, and it says, where is this source? Menah hanimili. Where do these words come from? The oral Torah cannot extend beyond the boundaries that the written Torah formulates for it. So if you have an oral Torah law that cannot be traced back to the written Torah, or within the format, the infrastructure that the written Torah provides. So if it's not, let's say, a rabbinical law, Lachal Mashmi Sinai, etc., then we know there's something wrong with your idea. And many, many times in the Talmud, there's a rabbi who proposes an idea, and they say, wait a minute, where's its source? And it goes through all the sources, and ultimately it says, tiyufta. It's a question. We have to discard that. Because the written Torah is there to ensure that the oral Torah doesn't get corrupted. Humans are fallible. The scholars, they try very hard to ensure that they don't make mistakes, but mistakes can happen. But we can easily fix mistakes or teachings that go awry with this dualistic method of transmitting the same information. So that's number one. But number two, this is also maybe a little counterintuitive. A lot of people in the room here, and I'm sure watching online, listening, they went to university. And certainly they didn't go to university. They went to schooling of some sort, traditional schooling. Some people go to homeschooling, so maybe that's not so relevant. But, I have students, they're in med school for 10 years. Get the book. Memorize the book. You spend all that money. You go to law school. Why don't you go to law school? Read the book of laws. You know it. Intuitively, we realize that if you really want to study a subject, the learning from a teacher, right, it actually works a lot better. You can use examples, you clarify things you don't understand, tonal inflections really matter a lot. It's simple to us that if you want to understand how to be a physician, how to be a lawyer, how to be an accountant, how to be a geologist, how to be anything, right? You have to go to someone who's going to teach you. And you have to listen to lectures. And you have to have a relationship with a mentor, who's going to guide you if you want to do advanced scholarship. You'll have someone who's helping you with your thesis or with your doctoral thesis or your graduate work. We understand that. But Torah is much more complex than anything we could study in any of the sciences, or any of the mathematics, or any of the law. It's more difficult. It's very difficult. And you expect us to just read it out of a book? So clearly, I think this is just as a beginning. Yes, we find a remarkable playing off each other with the written Torah, oral Torah, number one. Number two, it's just a better way of learning. And like we said, to assume that you write things down, they'll be understood later, is a gross misrepresentation of human capacity to do that. Words just don't pop out of the page like they do when it's taught in an oral format. But there's more. When you write something down, like we mentioned, you become limited to what, to the words that are on the paper. You're teaching something. The way a competent teacher does it, they present ideas. And the ideas are malleable. and be transported to different applications. So, you take an idea and you say, okay, there's 4 or 5 examples of that idea. But you're giving over more than a specific idea. You're taking a principle that can be applied to other ideas. And this is very critical, for example, in Torah study. Because remember, Torah, if it's from God, like we say it is, and we've proven that it is, therefore it has to be capable of withstanding the evolvement of technology, for example. So you want to know how to observe Shabbos. Suddenly there's a refrigerator in your house. What do you do now? So if you had the final book of Oral Torah, you would say, okay, I'm going to go under refrigerator and see what they say. Problem is, it was written 2,000 years ago before refrigerators were invented. Or cars, right? Or cell phones, or motion detecting lights that pop up by your neighbor's house when you walk by it. Right? Or a lot of things. Now for us, because we have the Oral Torah, in the method that it was given, right, we are able to take the principles and apply the principles to changing situations and scenarios. But if the Torah was written, but it becomes much harder, by the way, because since the Oral Torah was written, we have a lot of fixed examples, and then when you take an example, you have to extrapolate the principle out of the example and then apply the principle forward. So I'll give you an example, very, very modern, very ancient example. There's a whole book in the Talmud called Baba Kama, that the first, I believe, 6 chapters deal with the laws of damage of my property damaging your property. So my ox gores your ox. I don't know many people that have oxen, and this is not such a common situation in modern day, industrialized world. So if I want to know the laws of my property damaging your property in modern times, I have to study the examples of yesteryear. I have to extrapolate the principles out of it and then apply the principles to modern situations. So that makes it much harder. However, if the Oral Torah was still active today, if it was still entirely oral, I wouldn't be studying about cows and oxen and all those things. My animal eats your stuff, your produce and your field. I don't have a field, I don't have an animal. I would learn the principle, and that principle would be much easier adapted to modern situations. Now, we have the laws of blessings, right? You learn the laws of blessings. So you read the book of Brachos, and it talks about all these ancient foods that you've never heard before. And it uses the names, the Aramaic names of dishes that people stopped cooking 2,000 years ago. That's what you have to work with. Because when they wrote it down in the language that they're used to. But remember, that becomes fixed. This is a finalized text of the Oral Torah. The Mishnah is finalized. The Talmud is finalized. We can't adapt it. Well, what do we do? Well, what is this obscure kind of, crepe? How thick was it? Was it made of? We don't know. Because it was a common food. If I said pizza, well, you know what pizza is? In 2,000 years, maybe they won't be eating pizza. I assume they will, right? Pizza's pretty good. But if I wrote today, the blessing on pizza is X, Y, or Z, people stop eating pizza 1,000 years from now. 2,000 years from now, they're like, well, what does that mean? Well, pizza. Get pictures of what a pizza looked like and try to understand, well, why would people eat it? That's what we're doing, basically. We learn the laws of blessings. All these obscure, ancient, archaic food types. We have to understand, what is this made of? How is it made? And working backwards to extrapolate the core principle from that, and then we use that to apply to donuts and modern foods like that. So it becomes much harder to write it down. That's the tremendous drawback of writing down Oral Torah. However, Oral Torah in its pristine format, when it's being transmitted orally, it becomes much easier to adapt principles to new situations. That's another reason why the Oral Torah was initially maintained in its oral format. Another reason, to keep it out of the hands of Gentiles. So this, may sound strange, but in our history, we've had almost nothing but grief from the Torah being in the hands of non-Jews. For example, the day that the Septuagint was commissioned. Septuagint is the first translation of the Torah to a foreign language. That language was Greek. King Ptolemy II or third, doesn't even matter, He commissioned 70 rabbis to translate the Torah, this document that the Jews are obsessed over, translate it into Greek. And he took these 70 rabbis and he isolated them into different rooms, 70 different cubicles. They can't talk to each other, they can't collaborate. And they had to write this, what's called today the Septuagint. Sept is from 7, 70, the translation of the 70. That day in Jewish history is marked by a fast day, the day of mourning. Ever since the Torah has been handed on Jews, they've used it against us, they've misinterpreted it, they've perverted it, they've mistranslated it. It has been nothing but grief for us. But we had to have a written Torah, but that's the danger. You have a written Torah, and it's a physical document available as opposed to the oral Torah. It's in your heart. It's not as easily accessible. And that's another reason why the oral Torah was maintained oral. But I think there's a little bit of a deeper insight. It's not just we want it to be not in the hands of Gentiles, but the idea of Torah being more than just a body of knowledge. It's not just information that we're trying to acquire and impart on our children. It's a way we relate to God. Right? This is how we relate to God. It's God's Torah. We cleave to Torah, and by virtue of that, we have a deeper understanding of God. In fact, one of the ways the Torah is described is that it's our betrothed. It's almost as if we're married to Torah. We're connected to Torah on such an intimate level. Therefore, what really binds us with Torah? What creates this special relationship where it's us and the Torah, or the Torah and us? That's oral Torah. Written Torah, it's like we connect to it kind of, we have 18 inches between us and written Torah. Right? We read it, we study it, but it's still without us. Oral Torah, it's something that's in our hearts, so to speak. We have to memorize it. It's within us. And that deep relationship with Torah, that's for the Jewish people. The Jewish people stood outside and we accepted the responsibilities, but also the privileges of Torah. With oral Torah being in the hands of non-Jews, it's inappropriate. And by having the oral Torah in its oral format, that ensured that the Torah would be ours, or at least certain parts of the Torah would not ever get in the hands of non-Jews. That would be indeed a fourth benefit of having the oral Torah oral and not written. Now, next week we're going to talk about, what happened? Why was it written? But we'll probably talk first about, how was it maintained in its oral format, and then why was it ultimately written? Because now most of the oral Torah is indeed available in written form. Like I said, Rabbi Judah the Prince wrote down the Mishnah, which is part of the oral Torah. Later, when the Talmud was written, even later, halacha, or most of halacha, or a lot of halacha was written down, was formalized. So there are still vestiges of oral Torah that are purely oral today, but the vast majority of the oral Torah was indeed written down, which is a question. If there's so many benefits of keeping the oral Torah oral, and indeed it's prohibited by Torah law to write down the oral Torah, why was it ultimately written down? Which is a critical question we'll get to next time. Okay, a fifth reason why oral Torah is oral and not written down. We study Torah. And in some places we study Torah, we study mathematics, we study physics, we study English history, the sciences. We realize the Torah is different. The Torah is from God. It's godly wisdom. But to actually study it, what do you have to do to study oral Torah? You have to dedicate yourself to it. You have to open up your mind and your hearts. You have to challenge yourself. It's a lot of information. Typically, young pupils, when the oral Torah was oral exclusively, young pupils would go and study oral Torah for 14 years at a minimum. That was basics. 14 years of study, intense study, 18 hours a day, maybe, up to 18 hours a day. That's dedication. Right? The relationship that we have with Torah is when we realize this is from God. And it's tremendously transformative wisdom. It connects us to God, it connects us to Torah, it connects us to ourselves. And when it's oral, it becomes a little bit more exclusive, a little bit more harder to obtain. And therefore, to achieve it, to study it, we have to work even harder. We have to really have dedication. And it's important for us. It's important that that the Torah is not just, the wisdom of the Torah is not just given out, just given out on the corner. Every corner there's a little ice cream van that gives out Torah. No, it's important for us to realize that the Torah, the wisdom of Torah is not dispensed like gumballs. We have to dedicate ourselves to understanding it. And by the way, even when the Oral Torah was written down, the tremendous visionaries that wrote it down, they worked very hard to still maintain an Oral Torah flavor to it. They still wrote it over in a way that it's not entirely user-friendly, which is remarkable because these are men of incomparable genius. And they deliberately wrote the Oral Torah in a way that it's still, you have to work hard to understand it. You still have to dedicate yourself in time, tremendous amount of time. They didn't use indexes. They didn't start logically necessarily. I'll give you an example. The tractate Shabbos, which deals with Shabbos. Right? So there's a Mishnah, I believe on page 74, that says there's 39 categories of work, and it goes to one after another, right? It says there's plowing and planting and harvest, right? It goes one after another. Very logical. That should be the place where it should start. A lot of people, when they learn the laws of Shabbos, they go to page 74 and start from there. Right? And if you think about it, like the editors, these are brilliant people, like they should have started maybe Mishnah 1, chapter 1 with, this is what Shabbos is about. There's 39 categories, and then break it down from there. And they start with the laws of carrying, of taking from one domain to another domain. Seems bizarre, right? But the intention was to give over Oral Torah with as much of the genuine Oral Torah flavor that demanded that we work hard to understand it intact. Give me another example. Agadita. That's a word that if you know what I'm talking about, your eyes will light up. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're like, wow, what did he say? Agadita, or agad, like Haggadah. It's a very similar word. There are sections of Talmud called Agadita, loosely translated as homiletic or ethical or philosophical parts of Talmud. But basically anything that's not pure law, that's not halacha, like what to do as a Jew. It's more like what to think as a Jew, what to understand as a Jew, how to behave as a Jew. Kind of the fuzzier parts, it's called Agadita. Now, you read one page of Talmud, half halacha and half Agadita, like half standard Talmud, and half, you're like, this was written by two different people. It's almost like we can have Bible criticism for Talmud. You cannot imagine that the same architects authored these vastly different methods of instruction. You won't believe it. Why? Because when it talks about the laws of Shabbos and the laws of circumcision, all the laws, it tries as hard as to get to the bottom of the issues, to understand the principles, to understand the applications of it. When it talks about Agadita, the philosophical, the ethical, the inspirational, the behavioral, the philosophical, the theological parts of Torah, it talks in metaphors, it gives stories, it gives examples that are outrageous, it says bizarre ideas, and you read it like, wow, what did it teach me here? Example, I gave a lecture on this once. The Talmud says there are three things that are a measure of the world to come. Three things in this world that are like the world to come. Shabbos, the sun, going to the bathroom. That's it. That's all you have. These are the same authors that try to give us clarity in every law, organizing it and codifying it and distilling it. That's it. That's all we have. There's no explanation. And the idea is that when they wanted to convey the deepest, most profound, most esoteric, most special ideas of Torah, they wanted to ensure that the only way you'll understand it is A, if you're dedicating yourself to it, if you spend 6 months trying to understand it, and B, if you have a very broad base of knowledge from the rest of Talmud. What they would do is, they would take an idea, break it up into 5 or 6 different pieces, and scatter those pieces throughout the Talmud. So you have one sliver of it, 3-4, what? You have no idea where to start, right? And it's hidden in plain sight. It's all there. All you gotta do is spend 20 years studying Talmud intensively and you'll know it. So it's almost as if they took, like, the same difficulty of trying to understand, the enigmatic Torah and working and dedicating and toiling and strenuous, continuous study over a long time, the same flavor that the Oral Torah was transmitted, and they just wrote it down. But the work is the same almost. And by the way, that does not apply only to the Agarata. Agarata is where it's more pronounced. But even the halacha. You want to know the halachas of something, you have to know every place in the Talmud that it discusses it. And that's why extracting halacha out of Talmud is so difficult. It's all there, but it's not organized in a clear fashion. And some parts, some huge sections of Talmud, a lot of them are cut up into 4 or 5 pieces, scattered throughout the Talmud, go find them. So it's almost as if the Oral Torah had to be written down. We'll get to why next week. It had to be written down. But even when it was written down, they maintained the same reasons why it was initially oral. They tried to perpetuate that in the finalized, codified version of that. You know, I always say that, imagine you have an encyclopedia. Encyclopedia Britannica, I think it's 38 volumes. Tiny letters, thin pages. It's an enormous amount of information. But it's not alphabetized. And every entry is cut up into 4 and scattered throughout. Imagine you had that. You have all the world's information at your fingertips, but you don't even know where to look for it. You gotta find the needle in the haystack. You find one needle, now you have to find the other 3 needles. And that's what the Talmud is. It has everything there, but some things are hidden, and some things are scattered, and some things are cut up into 4 pieces. And the job that we have to study and to understand it is almost the same as it was prior. You still have to work hard. So they managed to accomplish almost everything that they wanted to do, and yet avoid losing the special benefit of keeping the Oral Torah oral. Just incredible. If you think about the genius of the people that wrote down these books. It's unbelievable what they managed to do here. Take all the Oral Torah, organize it, and then disorganize it. But disorganize it in an organized fashion. And then take all the parts and cut them up into a few pieces, throw them at the Talmud and 63 books. Go ahead, right? It's accessible, yes, but you still have to work really hard. And by the way, we'll talk more about it, but the Shulchan Aruch, Book of Code of Jewish Law, one of the books that is on the Mount Rushmore of Jewish books. All of Jewish law. What he did is he dealt with the Talmud, and he's like, wait a minute, what's halacha? Well, how do we behave as Jews, right? It's all in the Talmud, go find it, right? So he basically unscrambled the Talmud, and unscrambled the Rambam, unscrambled everything and organized it, by ideas. All the laws of mezuzah, for example, all in one place, and all the final conclusions. And that was a little bit controversial in his time. Some of the great rabbis of all of Jewish history were a little bit disappointed. Suddenly, you don't have to work to study. It's everything's there. Everything. The word Shulchan Aruch, what does it mean? Shulchan Aruch means a set table. You don't have to work at all. It's all set. You go to the restaurant, right? You don't have to set the table. Why not? In your house, you have to. Well, they take the work out for you to charge you a premium, right? That's what he said. My book is the set table. Anything you want, you just come and eat it. You want to know the laws of Sukkah? Just open up the book. There's indexes. Go there. It's all organized. You don't have to worry about it anywhere else in the Talmud, right? He unscrambled it. And some people were a little bit disappointed. Wait a minute. What happened to toil of Torah study? Because the Talmud, when it was written down, it was maintained in the oral format. You have to work hard. And initially it was kept oral because there's no other way to study Oral Torah in its true oral fashion without working. And even when they wrote it down, they ensured that the work will have to continue on. That's the 5th reason why Oral Torah is oral. Let's go on to number 6. To enable incremental learning. Let's assume that the Oral Torah was written by Moshe. He wrote an Oral Torah, Written Torah. Every kid, when they go to school, every first grader in school, they have what's called a Chumash party. They get a Chumash, it's a party. Right? What they would have otherwise, if everything was written down, they'd have a Chumash party, but it would be an entire bookshelf of books. And every little kid would say, well, this is Torah, right? Every kid would have to start studying with everything, because it's all the same, right? It's all the same, there's no way to scale up to it, right? Because assuming had Moshe given us everything, written Torah, all in finalized books, well then that would kind of all have the same status. We have to start with everything. Could you imagine how overwhelming that would be? Could you imagine, younger students or weaker students or less experienced students, just this barrage? Just imagine how difficult it is. We're adults in this room. If I took all of Talmud and threw it at you, threw it at me, threw it at anyone, it's difficult. It's a process. Oral Torah, what happens? You go to your classroom. First day of Oral Torah study teaches you one thing, or another thing. And progressively over 14 years at a minimum, you get the capacity to kind of expand and to get there where you know all of Torah. If you just had a book, you'll be like, where do I start? This is too much. And today, people look at the Talmud, all of Talmud. You start at one end of the shelf, and you start moving your eyes to the other end. And that's just Talmud. And then you have the tour. Oh my gosh, 22 volumes, tiny letters, thin pages. And Shulchan Aruch. And all, it becomes overwhelming. You walk into any basic Jewish library, and you're like, this is not even all of Oral Torah. This is so overwhelming. You have Oral Torah in the ancient days. You come, maybe you memorized Chumash. You memorized all 5,845 verses. You have a baseline, a little bit of a framework. Well, let's start learning the laws of Sukkah. What's a Sukkah? What does it look like? Think of that side, right? And you could kind of move from there. Additionally, this is a little bit of an extension of the same idea. What would happen if the Oral Torah was always written? Every guy would assume that they're experts. I've written Torah, you've written Torah. We both bought it in the same store, right? I have an Oral Torah, you have an Oral Torah. We both bought the same finalized work. And suddenly we kind of have this equal footing where every fool and every charlatan, they assume that they're the greatest scholar that ever existed. That's what they assume. Because what do you mean? I have the books, you have the books, I can look it up, you can look it up. What's the difference? The Almighty wanted us to, it's not just about information. The Almighty could have pre-planted us with all of Torah. We could have had like the Matrix, right? You just have all the information buzzed into your brain, right? The Almighty wants us to grow and to change. And therefore, there are people that are great Torah scholars and people that are not such great Torah scholars. Right? It depends on how much they work. If you have an organized Oral Torah, everything's there, everything's organized, everything's, right? Today, right, if there's a greatest rabbi and then there's someone like me, we want to know the halacha, right? So he maybe knows it by heart, but now I go to the Mishnah Berurah and I find the same halacha that he does. It's a little bit of a problem. Almost anyone can play a rabbi, right? Now they have online. You can Google your question. If you could Google, you can know all the answers. Is that what we want? What happens then? Everyone assumes that I know all the answers. I don't need the rabbi. When I know nothing about Torah, I don't understand the sensitivities of every delicate issue. I don't understand how to approach the subject. What happens then? Everyone says, no, I disagree, because I think I'm on par with all the great Torah scholars. You have divisiveness. Everyone says, I think I'm going to interpret that way. I have my own way of interpreting. You suddenly have a divided nation. So ironically, by making the Oral Torah more difficult to understand, by not being written down, you could kind of figure out who are the scholars and who are not so much the scholars. And that way we know who are the leaders of the people. We know who are the authorities on whatever matters that are important in Jewish life, in Jewish communities. Like we said, even when the Oral Torah was written, it was written in a way, it kind of mirrors the process of Oral Torah in its oral format. When it was written down, we have written Oral Torah. It's a little bit confusing, I know. We have Oral Torah when it's just oral, and then it was written down. But even when it was written down, it was still written down in a way that's still kind of hard to separate. It's kind of easy to separate the people who really know things from the people that are pretenders. You know why? Because it's still kind of hard. You say, you think you know it? Okay, well, what does the Talmud say here? What does the Talmud say there? Well, how do you understand it? Just compare and contrast. And all there's still room for us to kind of understand who are going to be the leaders of the community, who are going to be the experts of Torah, and who's not. Maybe that's one of the problems that the commentators had with Rabbi Joseph Kaira. All of halacha is written down, and now everyone can know the halacha. Of course, there's a tremendous benefit of everyone knowing halacha. They can all behave properly as Jews, of course. So of course that greatly outweighs the problems. But there is this idea, this benefit of having the oral Torah exclusively oral. Next reason. What happens if you have a written, formalized oral Torah? Everyone gets for the bar mitzvah gift a copy of Oral Torah. They go to their basement and start reading. Okay, maybe they'll know something. Maybe it'll go awry. Like we mentioned, that's one problem. People won't understand it. They won't have someone to teach them. That's one problem. We spoke about that prior. But what happens to the Jewish community? What happens to building relationships with previous generations? What happens with this continuous link all the way back to Sinai, where it's possible for someone living in 2016 to say, I studied from my teacher, who studied from his teacher, who studied from his teacher, all the way back to Moses? It's still possible to say that. What happens if you all got the document? What happens to the community? In fact, there's a statement in the Talmud, which is kind of a little scary, a little radical, but the idea is a crucial idea. O chavrusa, o misusa. Either I have someone to study with, or I'm dead. To really grow as a Jew, to grow as a Torah scholar, to grow as a community, we need to have interactions. The Talmud talks about what happens when someone studies Torah. Someone studies Torah by themselves, it's tremendous. But if you study Torah with someone else, and the more people that are there, the greater the atmosphere of Torah study. First of all, the more accurate the Torah will be that's conveyed. Because the more people you talk to, you can debate, you can discuss, you could, bounce ideas of other people. But this is a Jewish environment. You know what happens when there's a Jewish environment? We grow every other area of our lives. People on their own, they're not connected to the community. Maybe it will be possible to write down the Oral Torah in a way that people understand. Even so, there's a benefit to force the people to create a cohesive environment where people are dedicated in cause and purpose and mission to study Torah together, to grow together, to help each other. What kind of a dynamic group is that? And how much better a situation is that for growth and development as Jews? And lastly, and this is a little bit the other way around, as students, we would grow certainly from studying with other students. Pilpul Chavreim, Ditkun Chavreim, the names that are called in Jewish literature, to debate and to refine with our friends. What about the teachers? What forces someone to grow more than being forced to teach? The Talmud tells us, when the great rabbis announced, I studied lots of Torah from my teachers. I studied even more from my colleagues, from my friends. And mitalmida yoser mikulam, from my students more than any one of them. Nothing teaches you more than having to teach others. So this is kind of from the flip side. Of course, it's better to study from someone alive, breathing, dynamic human, or group of humans, but we grow collectively by having the teachers also improving themselves. You could teach, if you teach to yourself, you're kind of limited. You teach it forward, you yourself become a greater scholar. Ironically, you learn more from your students than you learn from your teachers. I'm saying, I spent many years as a Jew, and I never made as intense of understanding of why Oral Torah was oral until I was forced to give a class in it. So you guys, and whoever's watching online and listening online, you guys are forcing me to study. Well, what happens, right? I'm teaching this orally, and now I'm growing as a scholar and as a student of Judaism. So, in conclusion, the question is asked. Why is the Oral Torah? Just write it down. And yes, it's a good question, but it's important to know it's a simplistic question. First of all, it presupposes that writing it down would be effective, and we know it's not effective. The Constitution was written down. It was written down. And you know what? Today, a mere 200 some odd years later, we don't know what it means. It's up to interpretation. Half the country says Second Amendment means one thing, half the country says something. How is it possible? How many words is it, right? It's not even so many words. That's just the way things work. You write something down, everyone interprets it their own way. There's no inflection. We don't know what it says. We cannot possibly, if we had a recording maybe of Thomas Jefferson, maybe we would have a little bit more clarity what he meant. How exactly did he present it? What does a militia mean? Well-organized militia. I don't know what the words are, sorry. A well-read militia should not be, the rights to have a well-read militia should not be curbed or something like that, infringed upon. It's a sentence. We have no idea what it means. It's a single sentence. It was written down. It's clear. Well, it's not so clear. If Thomas Jefferson was here and he was teaching us, we would know what he meant. We would know. No question. As simple as that. But even if we could find a way, we're clever, we're geniuses, we could find a way to give over the Oral Torah in a written format, there are so many, we went through 9 different reasons why it's still better, it's preferred for a variety of reasons to have it transmitted orally. It's a better method of communication. We benefit greatly. And even when the Oral Torah had to be written down by necessity, the feeling, the flavor, the methodology of the Oral Torah was maintained to the degree that it was maintained. So, for example, we look at the Oral Torah, it was written down incrementally. It was written down the Mishnah, then the Talmud, then the Halacha over various different iterations. Why was it not just all written down? Well, they wanted to minimize. Remember, they had a necessity, they had a reason that they were mandated. They had to write down the Oral Torah, or else Jewish people would cease to exist. But, write the minimum. And at every stage of writing down the Oral Torah, they had to write down just the bare necessities of what needs to be written down because of the variety of reasons that we propose, and maybe there's even more, of why it's still the preferred method to have it transmitted in its oral format. Next week, God willing, we're going to be talking about why or how the Oral Torah was transmitted so well without mistakes. How we only find disagreements 1,300 years into the process, or 1,200 years. There's no disagreements. We don't find any disagreements. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Somehow we managed to survive 1,300 years without any disagreements. And why the disagreements happen, and why it had to ultimately written down, but also how was it perpetuated, and what were the dramatic existential transformational shifts in Jewish life that forced the decision, the weighty and visionary decision to write down the Oral Torah.